Uh, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming into our class today. I want to let people know that we have uh, a webinar going, so you'll see things a little bit differently, but basically we have uh, panelists coming in, actually one panelist today, and in the webinar format, you can use the raise hand feature that you see on the your menu below, and questions will be handled from that at the end of the presentation. Additionally, you can type questions in the Q&A, and we can have responses from that again at the end of the presentation. At this point, I'm going to put up a welcoming, a couple of other things. We are recording this, so I'd like to let people know that that will be available, and we are live streaming to YouTube, where we're available there as well. Closed captioning also is enabled, so you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. At this point, let me start a welcome video.
안녕하세요. 이 강의에 오신 것을 환영합니다. I am Kyuno with the ARP, and I would like to welcome you to our program this evening. ARP Virginia is thrilled to be collaborating with Usher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University to bring our members a sampling of the rich program offered by OLLI Mason each semester.
Greetings from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. OLLI Mason has been around for over 30 years, serving curious individuals who participate in lectures, clubs, trips, and special events, as well as volunteer opportunities, such as teaching and service on committees. I want to welcome all of our OLLI Mason members, as well as those of you who are in Virginia and across the United States online through our AARP connection. I want to especially welcome our sister campus, Mason, Korea. We are very happy to be collaborating with Mason, Korea to bring this Live from Korea series to you. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University, and I encourage you to visit our website to learn more, olli.gmu.edu. Thank you and enjoy the presentations.
Hi, I'm Mark Ginsberg, George Mason University's Provost and Executive Vice President, and greetings from George Mason University, Korea, where I am today in beautiful Sangdo and Incheon, South Korea. It's a pleasure to encourage you to take part in and participate in Live from Korea. You know, George Mason University and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute have a long-time partnership. And this new program that brings together people from our campus in Incheon and Sangdo, South Korea, and provides an opportunity for our colleagues from OLLI to learn about some of the issues in Korea, some of the cultural heritage and wonderful experiences that people have had in Korea, and to participate in and learn about the importance of the relationships between the United States and South Korea. George Mason in Korea is an important campus, an integral and related experience that our students have the opportunity to participate in. And I know that you too will benefit from, enjoy, and have the opportunity to learn about these important relationships. I hope you enjoy Live from Korea.
Greetings. I'm Robert Matz, Dean of George Mason University's campus in Korea. Mason Korea and Mason OLLI are delighted to collaborate to bring you this series, Live from Korea. Today's presenter is Ms. Suzanna Samstag. Ms. Samstag came to Korea in 1980 as a member of the U.S. Peace Corps and had ended up living in Korea up until the present. Currently, she serves as a senior advisor to the chairman of the Daejeon Group, an energy and auto conglomerate. Prior to that, she ran a cultural institute, worked as a senior translator editor at Newsweek for its Korean edition, managed the global operations of Samul Nori, a traditional Korean percussion ensemble. She has also served on the Presidential Commission on National Branding and has advised the Ministry of Justice and the Bureau of Cultural Properties. I'm proud to say that she is also a member of the advisory board for Mason Korea and the parent of a Mason Korea graduate. Let me tell you a little bit about Mason Korea. Students who apply directly to Mason Korea spend 3 years here and then a year at our Fairfax campus or one of our other Northern Virginia campuses. Students who go to George Mason in the US can also come to Mason Korea for study abroad for either a semester or a year. If you'd like to learn more about Mason Korea, including opportunities for students to study here or possibilities for supporting scholarships for Mason Korea students, please go to our website at www.masonkorea.gmu.edu. That's www.masonkorea, all one word, .gmu.edu. And now, on to our presentation. Please welcome Ms. Samstag.
Good morning. This is about, 8:10 in the morning here in Seoul, South Korea. And I am so honored to have this opportunity to speak with you. In fact, I'm a little bit overwhelmed hearing the introduction. I'd like to ask Mike if he wouldn't mind putting up my PowerPoint and we can begin today. Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate all of your technical assistance. My presentation is entitled 4 Decades of Change in Korea. And I want to begin by saying that I am not speaking to you as an expert or an academic. And the experiences I describe in my presentation are all personal. And they're also my personal experiences. And I thought perhaps the best way to share the past 40 plus years that I've lived in Korea would be to share some of the photos. So this is basically a photo album of my life in Korea. Okay, we could have the next slide, please. This evening's talk will begin with the greetings from Seoul. And then I'd like to talk about my Peace Corps experience here in Korea. And following Peace Corps, I had the most extraordinary experience because I was able to become the manager of a traditional Korean percussion ensemble. And we ended up touring the world for about 14 years. And following that, I worked for Newsweek Korea. And through that experience, I worked there for about 10 years. I was able to get a bit of an insight into how important translation is and what impact it has on the daily lives of people here in Korea. And finally, I'd like to conclude with some remarks about how it's been to be a single mom and raise 2 Korean American kids here in Korea over the past 25 years. This has been an incredible period of transformation in terms of how mixed families like mine are viewed in Korea. And I think this is interesting because it's really very much the future of what Korea will be. Next slide, please. First thing I'd like to show you is exactly where I'm talking to you from. You'll see on one side a very, very old map of Seoul. It dates from the 19th century. And of course, now Seoul has a population of including the metropolitan area of about 20 million people. It's the 5th largest metropolis in the world and the 12th largest in terms of nominal GDP, which is gross domestic product. However, this ancient map of Seoul is still very, very much in evidence today. In fact, the mountain behind me is this mountain that is shown on your map. And in front of the mountain is a palace called Kyungbok Palace. And that's still visible here in this photograph taken from my office window. And you'll notice that there's a huge vacant lot here. And I apologize for showing you a vacant lot. But this is a very, very important piece of property here in downtown Seoul, because this is going to be the site of the future Igunhee donation hall. And Igunhee, if you don't know, is the son of the founder of the Samsung Group. And he passed away last year, and he donated an art collection that consists of 23,000 works of art. And among those, about 2,500 will be able to be exhibited at any one time in this location. The donation hall is expected to open in 2027, and it's being built at a cost of about $86.4 million. But it is an example of how Seoul has grown, not simply in terms of economic power, but in terms of its cultural power. And I think that in itself has been one of the major themes of my life here in Korea. The next slide, please. You may be surprised to hear that there was a Peace Corps here in Korea between 1971 and 2021. The GDP per capita grew from about $300 to over $34,000. But when Peace Corps first came to Korea in 1966, Korea was in very many ways a third world country. And over the next 15 years, until the time I finished my service in 1980, approximately 2,000 Peace Corps volunteers served here in Korea. Early groups had language training in the United States. In my case, we had language training here in Korea, which was a total immersion language training. I had never studied Korean. I had no idea about the language before I came here. And cross-cultural training was extremely important because Korea was very conservative when I came here, and things about how you had to dress, how you had to speak to people. In the case of women, we were often told about our clothing. We couldn't show bare shoulders. We always had to have something covering our shoulders. We wore sandals. We had to have socks when we wore sandals. Men, if they smoked cigarettes, they couldn't smoke in front of an elder, things like that. It was things about cross-cultural training that had to be definitively taught to people in order to make their lives here successful. Korean Peace Corps volunteers served as English teachers in the field of adult education, tourism, 4-H programs, special needs education, forestry, vocational training, public health. Public health was my area. I served as a TB control volunteer in a small rural healthcare center about 4.5 hours south of Seoul. But my colleagues also served as maternal child health workers, because in the countryside at that time, many women still gave birth at home. And they also needed help, assistance in doing that with birthing kids. And then another area that we were involved in was Hansen's disease. So leprosy was still a bit of an issue in Korea in the early 1980s, and volunteers worked in that area. Also, volunteers worked in physical therapy and as laboratory technicians. Next slide, please. I think I love this photograph because this is a picture of me in the center, along with my fellow Peace Corps volunteers during one of our very, very early training sessions. As you can see from the photograph, we were out in the countryside. We were just getting used to working with each other and getting acclimated to being in Korea. Next slide, please. this is a very important picture for me because in the middle is our first Korean language teacher, and I'm with 3 other volunteers. As you notice, we're all different ages. I was right out of college. I had graduated 1980 in May, and I came to Korea at the end of July in 1980. And as you can tell, an older couple came with us too, then served in a health clinic that was nearer to Seoul, maybe not as rigorous as being out far in the countryside. And the reason why this photograph brings back so many memories is that Peace Corps used a language training method called the silent method, which basically encouraged language production by the students rather than the teacher doing a lot of talking. That sounds impressive, but I can tell you from my experience, the first few weeks we were doing a lot of language production because we had to learn an entirely different alphabet, grammatical structure, and things like that. But once you get past the initial hurdles of that type of challenge, I think your language ability increases exponentially. And also you're generally sent to an area where no one spoke English. So if you were hungry or you needed to use the bathroom or anything, you were forced to use Korean. So I remember that as being a very, very difficult period of my life, but also ultimately very rewarding because it really encouraged me to learn Korean, which is absolutely essential to having successful life here. And next slide, please. This is a very, very typical photograph among Peace Corps volunteers. The woman in the pink hanbok, the traditional Korean dress, was my, I think, in a way, my Korean mom. She and her 2 sons hosted me during my first few weeks of training. There's many funny stories because obviously we couldn't communicate with each other very well. But I think that someone had told her that Americans like to have toast for breakfast. And I remember waking up in the house first night after the first night I had spent there, and she came in with a plate full of toast about this high. So she had basically toasted an entire loaf of bread because she had no idea of how much I was going to eat. And I couldn't explain to her that I only wanted 2 pieces. And she had obviously gone to so much effort to get the toast and make it for me early in the morning. So I ate a couple of pieces and I wrapped up the rest and put it in my backpack and took it to my training class. And I think she was so shocked by the fact that all that toast disappeared that she contacted the teachers in our training program and asked if she had to come up with an entire loaf of bread for me every day. And after I realized what I had done and what had happened, the teachers explained that she only needed to make 2 or 3 pieces of toast and that would be fine for me. But that was really only the very beginning of a series of many, many, many cultural interactions I had with my Korean families. Next slide, please. Now, later on, in looking back, this is a very critical photo. I am down at my clinic, my health clinic, and we are all dressed identically in hanboks. And we are doing one of the many, many government campaigns that health workers were expected to take part in. And what is interesting about this particular effort is that when I came to Korea, there was still an issue with very, very large families. And mainly it centered on the fact that a family felt that it had to produce a son in order to carry out various rituals later on. And we'd go visiting various families in the countryside and check and see, and maybe they had 6 or 7 daughters, and then finally they had a son. And in the early 80s, there was a very concerted campaign on the part of the Korean government to limit family size. So basically, we were singing a song about have only 2 children and, don't discriminate whether they're boys or girls, that type of thing. And ironically, I think Korea now has the lowest population growth in the world. So the joke is that maybe we did our job too well in the 1980s. Next slide, please. This is a slide showing very, very, very typical Peace Corps activity at the time. It says in Korea, Gyeongnam, which was the province that I was working in the health clinic in. And 보건 교육 refers to healthcare education. And then show is a kind of a riff on a very popular television show at that time. And you have to remember at this time, Korea did not have computers. There was no way to really get in touch with people, except when they gathered at regular market days. So we put together a health education show that we would present on regular market days in the countryside. Sometimes they were every 3 days or every 5 days. And during this period from April to May, we would travel around to the local marketplaces and do a presentation on basic healthcare. Next slide, please. So I'm shown here with 3 of my Peace Corps colleagues. And as you can see, we have a great audience. People are very curious about a bunch of foreigners trying to sing and speak in Korean. And here, one of our main focuses was nutrition, because if we had tuberculosis patients or we had leprosy patients, it was very important that they eat well in order to recover. And in addition, of course, they received drug treatment, but it was very important that in order for them to recover, that they had good nutrition. So this was really, really basic healthcare that we were trying to convey through our audiences in the marketplaces. Down slide, please. This is one of my early acting roles. You can see me seated in the front. I am wearing the very traditional pants for women at that time. Very comfortable pants with a pocket on the inside, so you could always have your money where you could get to it quickly and was safe. And you know, the towel around my head was also a popular fashion item at that particular time. And I am receiving counseling from another Peace Corps volunteer who is acting kind of like in a nurse role, and probably again birth control information from her. And then behind us is a very interesting banner because it gives all sorts of information about leprosy. For example, it says leprosy is not a hereditary disease. It's very, very difficult to transmit. It can be cured. And having leprosy does not necessarily mean that you are disfigured. So you can kind of tell by the contents of the banner that it was still very important to disseminate correct information about treatment of all sorts of different types of diseases in Korea at that time. Of course, what is really ironic is that now Korea has one of the best healthcare systems in the world, which was proven by how well they dealt with the COVID crisis. The next slide, please. And finally, you can't just go and not have fun. There you see the red drum there in the lower portion of the photograph. And I've been inspired, I don't know what inspired me, but to attempt to do some dancing in front of the visitors to the marketplace. So that was kind of a really important encounter, I think, because that kind of sparked my interest in the instrument itself. It is a 2-headed drum. And also I just felt that it was really important to be able to interact with people on not simply on the basis of giving them a lot of healthcare information, but enjoying their culture and having fun. I think that's the key to a successful Peace Corps experience. Next slide, please. So the next few slides I've prepared. I wrote a book about my experience in Korea. And there was a young illustrator who took a lot of the scenes that I described and transformed them into these wonderful, wonderful paintings. And I wanted to share just a few of them because I think that on the one hand, you can talk a little bit about the achievements that you have as a volunteer. And I think any volunteer, and I notice there are a few that are listening to my presentation, knows that the more, it's not a matter of how much you help other people or aid other people, but really at the end of the experience, it's how much you gain from it and how much you've learned that's really impactful. But in the process of living in a culture that was so different from mine, I committed a lot of faux pas, a lot of cultural errors, a lot of times when I was really insensitive to what was going on. And this is a very typical scene in that sense. In the countryside, the buses were crowded and everybody was carrying bags and packages. You can see in this picture in the background, there are two students, even students, their hairstyles were all had to be basically the same. They're in their black uniforms. That disappeared in the early 80s. And now, of course, there's a lot more freedom in what children can wear to school. But in this particular case, everybody on the bus, if you were carrying a bag or something, people that were lucky enough to get seats would always offer to hold your bag for you until you were ready to get off. And I had never experienced that. So I remember the first few times I got on the bus and I was standing there with my big bag and people were actually tugging on my bag. They were indicating that they would hold it for me on their laps. And I was shocked. I thought, they're trying to take my bag away. And it was only after I think, a couple of weeks that I realized that it wasn't that they were just anxious to help out. And so, I thought, that's really nice. And I got very comfortable with that custom. Unfortunately, now it's basically disappeared, but I remember that type of care that they demonstrated with a great deal of fondness. The next slide, please. And this is another incident in my, I guess my appreciation of bus culture in Korea. This shows the inside of a bus. And after a few weeks, I had gotten used to the custom of someone wanting to take my bag. I also noticed that young people would immediately hop out of their seats and offer it to an elderly person who was on the bus. And I thought, this is a very, very considerate, nice custom. So once I had the opportunity, there was an elderly woman got on the bus and I jumped out of my seat and I offered her my seat. And she refused, which again is very typical Korean behavior. She said, no, you sit down, you need to sit down. And hearing that, I figured out what she was saying. And then I sat right down again. And of course, everyone on the bus was shocked at this behavior because it's natural that people refuse 2 or 3 times. And in fact, sometimes you even have to physically grab them and sit them down before they'll take their seat. And everybody on the bus was so embarrassed by me not knowing that luckily a student who was sitting in front of me got up and offered her his seat and actually pushed her into the seat because she was still refusing to do that. So I realized that I had only grasped about 10% of the cultural sensitivity that I needed for these types of situations. Next slide, please. Most famous thing for me was the amount of food that people thought I was going to eat. I mentioned before the toast incident. I stayed at a house and again in the countryside, and people would get up early and eat a lot and then go out and do work on the farm. So naturally the woman who was running where I stayed, she assumed that I was also going to be able to consume huge bowls of rice and soup and all sorts of side dishes at 6:30 in the morning. And this was very, very hard for me to deal with because I didn't want to give her the impression that I didn't like the food. I love the food, but I just couldn't eat that quantity that early in the morning, and ended up eating a lot of it. And among Peace Corps volunteers, I think most female Peace Corps volunteers gained a few kilos at least while they were volunteers, whereas the male volunteers had to go out drinking with their colleagues a lot, and they usually lost a lot of weight. Next slide, please. In my house, we did not have a washer or dryer, obviously, and I had never tried to squat down on the ground and wash my clothing. And this me trying to do that was a source of great amusement by my hosts, and especially the woman who ran the place where I lived. And I would attempt to wash everything and think that I had washed it and go and hang it up. And then I'd see a few minutes later, she had taken everything down and was going to rewash it properly. So unfortunately, that was a skill I wasn't able to master to her satisfaction. Next slide, please. Finally, this is also many Peace Corps volunteers talk about their experiences in outhouses. I'm actually in an outhouse in this picture. It's very discreetly done though. And at that time, toilet paper was a luxury. People didn't use it in outhouses. And so I was interested to see that the students of the house, the young children who lived in the house, their old school textbooks would be hung up on a wire and used as a toilet paper. So there I am actually reading a first grade Korean language textbook, which was way above my level at that time. But anyway, look at the pictures. Good, next slide. And finally, there was one TV in the village, and in the evenings I would go over and kind of watch it for a while. But the only thing I could really understand were children's programs. And so I'd look at that and try and sing along with the little songs that they had for the children. It was basically nursery school level television program. So I'd be happily trying to follow along with these songs. And I think people in the village thought they were trying to figure out, exactly what type of person had come to their village that found great enjoyment in singing along with nursery school tunes. So, next slide, please. So to close out this section, Peace Corps had a tremendous impact on Korea, even though we had no idea at the time as volunteers. Many volunteers went on to make their mark in the world. There were English teaching programs and other types of instructional programs. So many people went back and became teachers and academics. I think many of the initial Korean studies programs that were started in the United States had great contributions from former Peace Corps volunteers. Since we did do a lot of work in the medical realm, there people went back and became doctors or involved in public health type things. Some people even went on to become diplomats. And then finally, I took this from an organization called the Friends of Korea, their website, which is really good if you have a chance. And check it out. It's just Friends of Korea. It's return Peace Corps volunteers and teachers and people who are interested in the relationship between the United States and Korea. And they use this expression, simply returning to the US as better informed citizens of the world. And I think whether you did anything that related to Peace Corps in the rest of your life, understanding what the impact of the United States and what our foreign policy is and how people view the United States, and attaining knowledge at a very grassroots level of the citizens of a foreign country is extremely important. And I think it can really have a positive impact on the rest of your life. And the second thing, which is really incredibly meaningful for Koreans, and I just heard about this the other day from a friend of mine too, totally unrelated to me, but the fact that Korea has moved from being a recipient country to a donor country. This is true in terms of UNICEF, for example. Korea was a recipient country for UNICEF for many years. And it's the first country in the world that is now a donor country. And it's among UNICEF's top 10 donor countries, which is amazing. When you think about that. The other thing that came from Peace Corps Korea is Korea decided that it was going to kind of develop its own Peace Corps organization, that they benchmarked Peace Corps, but of course, made it Korean. It's called KOICA, which is Korean International Cooperation Agency. And it was established in 1981 and combat poverty, promote sustainable socioeconomic growth. And really the interesting thing that's different from a lot of the work that we did in Peace Corps in my area was that even when they go to less developed countries, still those countries are very much interested in getting computer technology, startups, and social ventures. So the people that they select to serve as KOICA volunteers are very highly skilled in particular areas. Whereas in Peace Corps, a person like myself who majored in American studies and really didn't have any type of technical skills was very welcome to serve as a Peace Corps volunteer. KOICA looks for people that do have much more specific skills, because that's what countries are really asking for this point in time. And over the years, I've had a lot of interaction from KOICA, and they do a very, very good job for Korea and Korea's image outside of Korea. And one other thing before I finish this section is that in dealing with international organizations over the years, very often the United States serving as a role model is very difficult for less developed countries to really accept, because the United States is so far advanced in so many fields. But because Korea provides a type of role model, going from an extremely poor country to an extremely wealthy country, actually, at this particular time, without natural resources aside from its own people, it provides a more realistic example of what a country can do through educating its people, really, and investing in its population than the United States does. So in that sense, KOICA has had an awful lot of success, because it's much more approachable than perhaps the United States is as a role model. The next slide, please. So finishing Peace Corps, I wasn't quite ready to go back to the United States. Peace Corps was originally supposed to be for 2 years. Our program was cut short for various reasons. So I had only been at my site for a few months. I had gotten over really all of the major difficulties in getting used to living in a very, very different cultural setting. And so I wasn't quite ready to go back to the United States. Peace Corps offered to send me to a different Peace Corps country or pay for my plane ticket back to the US. But I thought, no, I've kind of just got myself established here. Maybe I'll stay on. So one way to stay on, because you need to have a visa to live in a foreign country, is I applied for a graduate program at a university here in Korea, and I got accepted into that and started my studies. But I also felt that learning in a classroom setting is important, but if you really want to understand the culture of another country, you have to get out and learn its music and its dance, learn the meaning of cultures and that type of thing, different colors in society, philosophy, how this translates into actual lifestyle practices and things like that. And as I was learning Korean, when I started graduate school, I went back to Korean language training, and there were really no Korean language training programs at that time. There were only, in addition to myself, there were 2 other foreign graduate students studying. So, I went back and I tried that out. And our Korean language teacher was also felt that the educational materials were pretty boring and things like that. So she took us out to see all sorts of different performances and concerts of traditional Korean music and things like that. This is about 1981, 1982. And she took us to see the performance of a traditional Korean percussion group named Samonori, which is what's shown on the banner that I'm holding there. Samonori literally means the play of 4 things. I didn't know that at the time. I just went to see this concert with my Korean language teacher. And I remember sitting in the theater in downtown Seoul, and I saw these performers, 4 men on a stage performing all percussion instruments. And I liked music, but I'd never studied music particularly. But there was something about hearing that music, and I describe it as there was a kind of a revolution in my heart when I heard that. And after the performance, I had to go up to the stage, and in very, very broken Korean, had to ask the performers, when is your next performance and things like that. And they were just 4 guys, and they were like, well, you want to come again and all this kind of stuff. And I said, sure, I'd really love to come. And at that time, of course, it was very difficult to find out that type of information, where they were going to be performing next. And so gradually I kind of hunted them down, and I decided I really wanted to study percussion, Korean traditional percussion. I love the dancing, I love the music, and for some reason I simply felt that I could do that. And to this day, I don't know why. It was just something that, I guess, fate or whatever. And so I finally hunted down where the guys had their rehearsal studio. And I went there one day, I busted my courage and I went up there and I knocked on the door and they were sitting around and I said, oh, you know, I'd really love to study the drums and everything. And they're like, no. And it was like brokenhearted, to say the least, because I had thought about this for weeks and weeks. And I didn't realize that the people who are really masters of a tradition don't teach beginners, okay, basically. And at that time, Korean traditional music was in a really huge period of flux. It had virtually disappeared during the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. The Japanese authorities were not happy with Korean musicians getting people together and raising their spirits. Many performers had given up on trying to make a living doing this. And so the tradition was at a very critical period, whereas basically dying out in most respects. But they didn't have programs in a traditional performing art. They didn't have programs where you could invite beginners to join classes. This is all changed. You can take basic classes at any culture center in your neighborhood. You can major in this from middle school, high school, up to college, get a PhD in it now. But at that time, unless you were born into a family that did the particular tradition, or you became what is known in Korea as a munhaseng, which literally means under the gate of your teacher. So you would come to live with your teacher and basically take care of all aspects of their life. And when they had the time, perhaps they would teach you something, but you had to really demonstrate how committed you were to this particular art form before they would share their knowledge with you. And of course, at that time, I had no idea. I just thought I could walk in there and learn, like, you know, I was going to go take ballet lessons or something. So I was very, very discouraged. And but I thought, well, I can't be discouraged for too long. So I decided to do a couple other things in the meantime before I actually, you know, could demonstrate to my future teachers that I would be a good and sincere student. So next slide, please. So I decided in my neighborhood, there was luckily a center where you could learn some traditional performing arts, although this center was set up to teach traditional performing arts that were now headquartered in North Korea. And I decided that I would start out by learning mask dance, drama. And if you look at the banner, it says Gangneung Talchum. Gangneung is an area that is in North Korea. It's in Hwanghae-do province. And Talchum refers to mask dance. And my teachers in this particular form of mask dance drama were all refugees that had come down to Seoul from North Korea after the Korean War. And they set up a small office where they could continue to teach their form of mask dance drama. And mask dance drama has many, many dozens of different forms throughout Korea. But I happened to pick this. I'm here with a fellow student. Next slide, please. And we studied for a few months and we were able to give a performance. You won't see my face in this performance because I am actually dancing as the back of the lion, because I was bigger and heavier than the other performers. They weren't exactly sure what to do with me, but they said, okay, you learn the back lion dance, because later on in the dance, I actually have to lift the performer that's dancing the front lion on my shoulders, okay? And then we do a little spin with her on top of my shoulders. So I was awarded that role because I was considered to be the biggest and the strongest. But I really enjoyed learning that particular form of traditional Korean performing arts. Next slide, please. Mike, could you do the Samonori clip for me, please? the information of the audience, this is Samonori, and one of the original founding members of Samonori is playing the janggo. Oh, thank you very much, Mike. Great. Okay. So these are some of the founding members of Samonori in this particular photograph. The man with the two-headed drum is Kim Dok-soo, and to his left, playing the gingori, is Lee Kwang-soo. And then the barrel drum is being performed by a man named Choi Jong-sil. And the jing, the large gong, is being played by Kang Min-sok, who was not one of the original members, but a longtime member of the group. And it was this particular ensemble and these four instruments that really fascinated me, and I determined to learn how to play these instruments. Next slide, please. The Samonori is also performed, there's a dance, and as you can see on their heads, there are hats with long white ribbons attached. And I was also determined that I was going to learn how to do that too. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, when I went in and asked them to teach me, they said no. They said no. But I finally wormed my way into their group, basically, by showing up at the practice place every morning about 6 or 6:30. And then I finally got the key to the place, and I cleaned up, all right. I cleaned the bathroom, I cleaned the rehearsal space, I made curtains, I bought furniture. I had a carpenter make the thing you see in the background for them to put their instruments in. I hung around basically and tried to pick up as much of the rhythms and the music as I could until they finally got used to me. At the same time, while I was cleaning up the office, I noticed that they had received some letters from the Asia Society. And I asked Mr. Kim, I said, oh, maybe we should answer these because they're inquiring if you're going to be able to come on tour to the US. And he was like, sure, good. So that time there was no typewriter, no computer or anything at the rehearsal space. So I took all of that to the school where I was studying and borrowed the school typewriter and started typing out responses to the Asia Society's request for touring. Next slide, please. And then in that process, I mentioned earlier that Korean traditional performing arts had reached almost this critical breaking point by the late 70s, early 80s. It was not popular anymore. Performers could no longer earn their living doing the traditional performing arts. So it was gradually dying out. And one of the main problems with that also meant that the people who made our instruments, our drums and the gongs and everything, these people could no longer make a living either. So there was a really critical point. And this photograph shows us visiting the last remaining factory that made the chango and the buk, the two main drums used in this percussion ensemble. And in the background, you see a very, very large drum that was going to be used in the opening ceremonies of the Asian Games and the Olympics. But the really shocking thing was that this particular factory was actually the last place in Korea that was making drums. Now, this situation has improved, but it gives you an idea of how close we came to losing this tradition. Next slide, please. Finally, after years, it seemed, of persistence, I finally got to get some lessons from Kim Dok-soo, master drummer, and this photograph shows us playing together. The thing about Korean traditional percussion music is that when I started learning, it was not written down. There were no scores for this or anything. And so basically, you had to learn it by speaking it. So for example, if there was a rhythm, your teacher didn't say, oh, it's written down over here, read that. He would say, okay, for example, dong, dong, boom, da, kung. So you would have to listen to what he was saying, learn it by speaking it first, and learn not only the rhythm itself, but the accents on the particular rhythm. So naturally, this was a great help in learning Korean language, but also extremely difficult for me to do this because there's no real way of notating it except by memorizing the way he spoke his rhythms. Next slide. Then after I had learned from a while, my teachers decided to send me out on the road. And in 1986, we did this program with people of Korean ancestry who are living in Japan, who were doing a big project to discover their roots as Koreans. And as part of this project, we taught them the 4 instruments and performed with them in small concerts. This is in Japan. Next slide, please. Then this is me doing a dance with my hat on. It's called a sangmo, and with a small drum called a sogo. So this took months and months of practice to be able to do this. It's very difficult. It looks easy, but it's really hard. Next slide, please. Then me teaching a group of foreign students at the US Army base, teaching them tango. This is part of their Korean culture exchange program. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is on tour in the UK with Samonori. See the 4 members. We had to do a kind of a parade. So I was dressed up in my mask dance costume, leading the parade, and the performers would play as they were walking along in the parade. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite photographs because we were in Germany after we had performed all over Europe. Then the next time they asked us to come back, we would not only give performances, but also give workshops. And drums took off exponentially in Germany. There were many, many musicians who came to learn the rhythms, but there were also people involved in musical therapy. And they would come and join our classes because they wanted to use their rhythms for treatment. So my teacher, Mr. Kim, is out in the front of the class, and I'm standing there on the side attempting to interpret what he's saying to the audience. He was not one for interval translations. He usually spoke for about 30 minutes and then looked at me and said, okay, translate. So it was a little bit of a high tension at that point. Next slide, please. And these are our students after class. And what I think is really, really, really impressive to me, looking back on this, is that many of you may be familiar with the popularity of Korean pop music and Korean dramas nowadays throughout the world. But really, these small workshops that we gave, I think were the real starting point for the interest in things Korea beyond, culture, the conflicts between North and South, but a real interest in discovering what Korean traditional culture is. And this was, many, many years ago, but I still see these people regularly when they come to Korea for follow-up lessons and things like that. Next slide, please. And again, this is a photograph of all our students in Japan. We gave workshops every summer in Japan. And as I mentioned before, there were kyopo, 제일 kyopo, which are Koreans living in Japan, but also many Japanese people came to learn Korean music, which was very significant cross-cultural experience because there's still a great deal of tension between Korea and Japan. But this was one way of overcoming it through these classes. Next slide, please. And this shows us with the 4 members of the group. 2 young women there in the photograph are from Hong Kong. And just before the Seoul Summer Olympics, we did a commercial for Nike. So they took us to Greece, and we had the performers perform in the middle of the Greek temples. And we thought that was a nice segue to Korea, Seoul hosting the 1988 Olympics. It was a fantastic commercial. Next slide. And then here I'm doing what I basically did as a road manager for the group. You see Kim Dok-soo on one side, and I'm attempting to communicate between 2 groups of musicians who are going to be performing with Samonori. Samonori would do traditional rhythms, but they're also very interested in expanding their repertoire outside of just the tradition. So they perform the man in the white t-shirt is named Steve Gadd, a very famous drummer. And so we're trying to figure out how to put together that performance for that particular evening. Next slide, please. And then this slide I love because this is right in downtown Seoul. And Kim Dok-soo is performing with 4 musicians. They're from Austria and Germany. And he is an extraordinary man. If you ever have the chance to see him perform in the United States, definitely take it. But so open to experimenting with other cultures, and other cultures were so open to experimenting with Korean tradition that I found this really to be one of the most exciting aspects of my work with the group. Next slide, please. Okay, I have, in this section, I'm going to close it out with a brief clip of a performance of traditional Korean music. The 2 female performers that are standing in the center of this are performing on traditional instruments, and their interaction with 2 other performers who are performing, one on a beatbox, other on a keyboard. And this is one of the really exciting ways that Korean traditional music is developed since the time I began to work with samonori. So Mike, would you please load this clip?
유루의 풍년가 들려드릴게요.
Right, thank you. So that kind of closed out the section on my experience with traditional Korean music. And I have to say in summary, what makes me really happy is that something that was on the verge of disappearing has now become so vibrant and such an important part of life here beyond K-pop that it makes me very, very happy and makes me feel like I made the right decision working with the group for all those years. The next section, I'll talk very briefly about my experience working for Newsweek Korea. I worked for Newsweek Korea from the time it started in 1990, early 90s until 1999. And this was a really interesting translation project, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. But before we get to that, I'll show you a few instances of some interesting translations. Next slide, please. I took this photo in my office. It is actually for manicure remover, but they've translated as nail remover, but I don't think you want to have your nails removed when you use this. Anyway, next slide. This one I found the other day. This is one of the dangers of automatic translation services. It says sticking phobid, that's a spelling error too, but actually it says post no bills, don't put up any like advertising material there. Next slide. The next slide is one of my favorites. My friends and I, we love this slide. It's actually at the top of a mountain near where I live. And the Korean says no smoking and no drinking. People come up, they do mountain climbing and they like to have, picnics on the mountain. So sometimes drinking is a problem. And of course, if you're in nature, you don't want people smoking. But interesting, the translation says no smoking and also total abstinence. So whenever we see this sign, we're wondering, from what point in time do we have to be totally abstinent so we can come up here? So we have mentioned this to the local authorities, but somehow they haven't gotten around to fixing it. But anyway, again, the dangers of auto translation, I think. Next slide. So I worked for Korea, the Newsweek, the Korean edition. And basically, we were started after a Japanese language edition of Newsweek was very successful in Japan. And a large newspaper company called the 중앙일보, which is one of the 3 major dailies here in Korea, decided that they wanted to make a Korean edition of Newsweek, especially for, at that time, 중앙일보 was part of the Samsung group. And they felt that by providing this magazine to their employees, it would increase, their global vision and outreach and everything like that. And so my job is working there. I was called a native checker. And what I was supposed to do is we received the English articles on Sunday, and we had to translate them into Korean by Sunday evening. And then finish everything completely, the entire layout of the magazine by Monday evening, and it was printed and it came out every Wednesday in Korea. So it was a very interesting experiment in translation because a couple of reasons. Number one, the translators didn't have a lot of time to get their work done. They had to be highly accurate and get it done within the deadline every Monday at 6. The other thing is that my job was to read the Korean translations and point out any mistranslations. Or the translators, while they were in the process of looking at an article, there were an awful lot of expressions that weren't in any dictionary. For example, during the Bill Clinton era, the expression "Bubba vote" came. And so our translators, of course, had no idea what they were referring to. And as a native checker, I had to be up on all this new terminology and be able to explain to them so that they could translate that appropriately into Korean. And as I was working, I worked about 10 years at this job, and I became very conscious of the fact that translation is incredibly important in a culture like Korea. So much of what people read or the music they hear or the movies they go to or so books, whatever, are translated. The percentage is extremely high. I think if you think about the United States, perhaps you'll read 1 or 2 books a year that are translated. But in Korea, the percentage of books that are translated, the percentage of movies that are shown on Korean screens is extremely high. And before we did this Newsweek, the company, 중앙일보, the parent company of this entire process, put a lot of money into hiring not only good translators, but a person like myself to check the translation. Because up to that time, there would be virtually no checking of any translation. And so the translators were first forced to rely simply on what they could get from dictionaries, which did not reflect the really living dynamic part of language. And I think that for myself, not only did the weekly exercise in trying to express American culture into Korean language helped me tremendously, I think that the entire process raised the issue of what kind of expertise is needed to be a translator. And very often translators were not considered very highly. They thought, oh, well, you've studied English or you've studied some foreign language, therefore you can do translations. But it's extremely complex and it requires separate expertise in each area that you are translating in. And therefore, I think that one of the things that we were able to do in this process was raise a consciousness of how important translation work is and how much expertise it does require. And of course, nowadays we have some interesting phenomena. We have the internet, so we have a lot more availability in terms of new terminology, or you can look up and find what the meanings are. Many of the portal sites here in Korea offer very dynamic group translation projects where a new phrase or terminology will come out in English, and then a group of Koreans will get together and attempt to translate that. And then their translations will put up on the site, and people interact with that and say, no, it's not this, maybe you want to have this nuance or whatever. So there's a huge consciousness of the importance of accuracy in translation, despite the 3 examples that I gave you, that there was not. So I think this improves the translation of captions for movies, subtitling for movies, and translation of novels. And then we have the opposite case of there's been a small increase in the number of Korean popular writers that are being translated into English. And of course, they have the same issue on the opposite side. But this, for me, has been always a very interesting intellectual exercise to figure out what way is the best way to express different ideas and concepts in another language. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I've already mentioned that, so we can go to the next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to conclude in the time that we have remaining by talking about myself and my 2 kids. I think the first 20 years of my life were basically spent managing Salmonori, doing what I wanted in terms of all sorts of different cultural activities, learning the music and the dance and things like that. And then these past 20 years have been basically raising my kids. I ended up as a single mom, so I had the challenge of raising 2 biracial kids in a very Korean environment. And of course, that was not without its challenges. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences. Next slide, please. These are my kids, my daughter and my son. I think this was my son. I'm trying to figure out if it's his 1-year birthday party. But anyway, they're all dressed up in their little hanboks there. Next slide, please. This is my daughter, and she's right in the center. She was quite tiny for her age. But obviously this was a Korean nursery school. They went to the neighborhood nursery school, and she was born in June. And all the kids that were born in June had their joint birthday parties. I volunteered to help out at the local nursery school. And I just was amazed at how well the nursery school was run, how the teachers were extremely dedicated and so well educated themselves, and their approach to teaching the kids. At my kids' nursery school, there were also 3 male teachers, which I thought it was a bit unusual in the Korean context, but it was very good for my kids to get the exposure to both male and female teachers. And the range of activities that my kids were able to engage in, I think, was just tremendous. And after volunteering at their nursery school, I realized that for very successful educational experience, probably the most important years are the 3 years most Korean kids spend in nursery school. They can enter at age 3, so they're at school from age 3, 4, and 5, and then they start elementary school. Next slide, please. And this is my son with three of his friends. He went to the same nursery school, and they went out to a little farm to look at the animals and stuff. Many people ask me, next slide, please. They assume that I would send my kids to international school or foreign school. Well, number one, they're not foreign, but my kids aren't foreign. They're Korean citizens. They're dual Korean and American citizens. But I felt that, living in the neighborhood I lived in, that it was very important that the two of them have friends that were nearby, that lived in the same neighborhood. And sending them to a local Korean elementary school, middle, high school, that type of thing allowed them to really put down their roots in the neighborhood, despite the fact that, appearance-wise, it looked a bit different. And one of the teachers said to me is that their Korean is fluent, but their attitudes are American, which I thought was very funny. So obviously they received a great deal of influence from me. But I have to tell you that working at the company that I do a lot of interviews for new employees. And I found that very often there is a serious language issue with our new Korean applicants, in that they've been sent abroad at a very, very early age, even as early as middle school, in order to acquire English fluency. And they've actually left Korea before they attained any type of deep fluency in their native language, which is Korean. And yet they go abroad, depending on the programs that they're involved in and the schools they go to. Very often they don't get the basic foundations in English grammar and things, because they come to the school after that's been taught. And what happened was, I found in interviewing prospective employees that had had long overseas educational experiences, was that despite the expectations of their parents and the amount of money that had been invested in their education abroad, that they had neither fluency in Korean or English. And this sounds really strange, but you need to have fluency in at least one language in your life. And I think that maybe perhaps they could speak English fairly well, but they did not develop deep comprehension or understanding of difficult texts in English. And ironically, that was the same was true for their Korean, because they hadn't lived in Korea long enough to really develop that kind of complex intellectual understanding of their own language. And so I saw this phenomenon with the people that I interviewed for my job. And unfortunately, people like that, we couldn't hire because they wouldn't be able to work in a Korean company that demanded true fluency in Korean, but also the ability to write in Korean and understand complex documents in Korean. And so my strategy for my kids was that I decided their first language is going to be Korean, which is, I think, a great language. And they grew up speaking Korean. We spoke English at home. And they had the advantage of going to Korean schools and learning a lot of English grammar. They teach that extremely well here. And I felt that it was incredibly important for them to have a language that they were fully fluent in and fully confident in. And English, another language, would be built on that basis. So if you have a good vocabulary in your native language, if you have a good understanding of grammar in your native language, if you have excellent reading comprehension in your native language, then you can use that as a platform upon which to learn other languages. And I think that it's very important to pick the time when you're introducing languages to children, because I had the experience at my kids' elementary school where I was going to just volunteer there. And a little kid saw me coming and he was like, started crying. And I was going, well, I know I look strange, but the reason why he was crying, he said, oh, he was afraid that someone was going to force him to speak in English. And he, even at the age of 4, he had already developed this terror of a foreign language, because he had been exposed to a situation through, an after nursery school class English language program, where he was basically intimidated in order to force him to speak English and things like that. And I thought, this is not the way you want to go with language development. Next slide, please. And this is my son. He is playing the piano at home. You can see he set up his audience in the background there on the chairs behind them. Put up a poster announcing that. Next slide, please. I also, since I was interested in traditional Korean performing arts, my son studied some pansori, and he gave a small performance at his school. Of course, every time I show this photograph, he denies that's him now. Anyway, next slide. My kids were also highly influenced by Harry Potter. So this is them role-playing some scenes from Harry Potter. One thing I was very lucky to be involved in is the children's theater movement here in Korea. And I took my kids to see theater almost every weekend, and they became excellent theater critics. And then they would also perform in plays at home too. Next slide. Then finally, this photograph. It shows a picture of us, the three of us kind of sitting around having some drinks at a bakery or whatever. And I have to say that growing up as I did here in Korea, when I was with them, I didn't necessarily feel that they were experiencing any particular prejudice, but the two of them, when they were alone, traveling around, taking the bus or doing their thing, they did experience some remarks. They didn't come home and complain about that because we're not a complaining family, but later on they did mention to people that there were sometimes, people commented upon their appearances or, found it strange that they spoke Korean, even though they were born and raised here. And there is still a great deal to be overcome in terms of that type of prejudice in Korea. And I mention this because, as I said, our Peace Corps efforts to encourage birth control in Korea have kind of backfired. And so there are a lot of women who come to Korea from foreign countries to marry Korean men because there's not an available Korean female population that wants to live in, for example, rural areas. And there is now a huge cohort of children whose moms basically are from countries like the Philippines or Cambodia or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or these places. And it's been a very, very interesting experience to see how Korean society has accepted or not accepted these children, and what changes are going to be necessary in society to really give these kids a prominent role in society. And there was one remark I heard when I was pregnant with my first child, and someone said to me, "Oh, when this child is born, they can, grow up and be an entertainer," which being an entertainer was very much the choice of many biracial children in previous decades because other avenues of education opportunity were not open to them. And I was a little bit taken aback by that because no one had said to me, well, your child can grow up to be a judge or lawyer or whatever, a politician or something. And I think that Korean society is doing its best to adapt to this situation, kind of in the same way that we went under cross-cultural training as Peace Corps volunteers. New brides, women who are very much younger than their husbands in many cases, undergo a lot of cultural training, language training, understanding how to live with in-laws and things like that. The Korean government realizes that these women and their children are going to be important parts of Korean population into the future. But in many respects, there's still quite a long way to go on this front. And I continue to hope that things will improve and that people's attitudes will change a bit about this, no longer look at these children as foreigners particularly, but as integral parts of Korean society. Next slide, please. So this is, again, the rationale for why Korea needs to really work on becoming a multicultural society. Population is in decline. And actually there's beginning this year, I believe it's minus population growth. And there farm work, the 3D jobs and things like that, that are generally filled by immigrants are really going lacking. Of course, this is greatly due to the COVID situation, but there is still a lot of exploitation of foreign workers who come to Korea because they have a visa. They can only work at one job. They're not allowed to switch jobs without prior permission and things like that. So there is a great deal to be done to protect people come either to work or as marriage immigrants to Korea, and make sure that if they are marriage immigrants, that their children are very much welcome and considered great assets to Korean society. Okay, next slide, please. And this is my daughter. She now works at a Korean hospital. She is an interpreter for foreign patients who come to use the Korean medical services. It's taken in our neighborhood. Next slide, please. And this is my son, a little plug for George Mason University here. Unfortunately, he graduated in August of 2020. And at that time, we had planned to have a graduation ceremony over on Songdo, where the George Mason campus is. Unfortunately, the week before, a huge outbreak of COVID occurred and all activities had to be canceled. So we decided to make the best of the situation. He wore his graduation gown, and we went in my neighborhood. There is the old Seoul city wall, and we went and took a picture in front of one of the oldest gates, and the Chinese characters that you see in the above say Chang Mun, which means in English, I guess, like to manifest righteousness. And so I thought that was an appropriate place to take a photo of my son in front of on his graduation day. Next slide, please. And finally, this is my son. He is doing his Korean military service. In Korea, if a male wishes to maintain his Korean citizenship, he's given Korean citizenship when he's born because his father was Korean. And of course, American citizenship, because I'm American. But for males, in order to maintain their Korean citizenship, they need to do their military service. And he is currently serving in Gunsan at a Korean Air Force base. He is in the Korean Air Force. He is an interpreter. And his most recent work was interpreting for the joint Korean-US military exercises that were held for about 2 weeks ago. I think he was interpreting for a US Army colonel, and they basically he had to be his interpreter 24 hours a day. So that was a pretty rigorous experience at UN Undergrad. Fortunately, he'll be completing his military service in October. So I have him back with me in October. Next slide, please. And finally, kind of a weird photo, but there I am still practicing my drumming with a few of my buddies there. We did a lot of winter workshops, and we had our masks on, of course, because we still have to wear masks indoors here. So this is my presentation for today. I hope I wasn't too long. I hope nobody dozed off. But anyway, if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them. So let's see. Well, this is very kind. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that George Mason knows how to contact me. So if there are any other questions or whatever that I can answer for you offline, I would be more than happy to do that. And everybody listening has an open invitation to come visit me in Seoul, because I will definitely give you a great tour of the city. Okay.
There are a number of questions in the Q&A. We can take a couple of minutes.
All righty. Let's see. Looks like all my relatives logged in to say thank you and interesting. I appreciate that. I'm trying to see where the questions are. Let's see.
Did you open the Q&A?
Yes, great. Okay. I'm very happy to hear that the mentoring of the young girl is going very well. Good. I'm very glad. Beautiful music. Peace Corps volunteer said hi. Hi there. I don't see any questions. Can you email the PowerPoint? I don't know. the person who wants a PowerPoint, could you email me first and tell me what you'd like to do with that, so I know that.
One asks what your thoughts are on how Koreans count their age.
I like it because well, actually, my daughter likes it because it makes her older than she actually is. Okay, because she's actually 24, but in Korean age she's 26, so she likes that, being older for some reason. I could go back to just counting by what our system, U.S. system is. I think for clarity that it's probably a good idea to do it like we do in the U.S. So when you're born, you're 1 year old, because the problem with that is that when you go to the hospital or a clinic and the doctor, sometimes when a doctor is prescribing medicine, it varies depending on your age, and 2 years can really make a big difference on the quantity of medicine. So being as exact as possible, I think, is probably a good idea. But it does cause a bit of confusion. And years ago, a lot of people were actually, their birth dates were not formally registered until they were actually 2 or 3 years old, because there was such high infant mortality rates. So that, of course, is no longer a problem. But having a tiny little baby and seeing this baby is 3 years old, first time you see them, is a bit of a surprise. But I think it's good to go with your actual age. Any other questions?
Yes, one question is how have Korean attitudes toward Korean adoptees in USA changed over time?
Oh, that is a very tricky question. When I was doing Salmonori, we would, when on our tours of the US, we'd always include a stop for Korean adoptees when we were asked. A lot of the parents of the Korean adoptees were very interested in introducing their kids to Korean culture. So in the summertime, there'd be a Korean language camp and a Korean culture camp. And we'd always stop by the camps and do a performance and then maybe a 2-day workshop, so the kids could have some experience of Korean culture if they were interested. I think the attitude has relaxed a bit. I remember there was a sad story among my Peace Corps volunteer group. A young woman came who was a Korean adoptee who had grown up in Montana, I believe. And she came to Korea. She didn't speak any Korean. She was just like us, learning language and about cultural sensitivity. And yet she experienced such a negative reaction because people were always criticizing her Korean language ability and, saying, you look Korean, but why don't you speak Korean? Are you an idiot or whatever? And she ended up not serving as a Peace Corps volunteer because the pressure was so enormous on her and the reaction was not positive. Unfortunately, in my case, if I said one word in Korean, everyone is like, oh, you must be so smart and wonderful. And so I really felt bad in those situations, frankly. But in recent years, it's been a regular topic on Korean news programs. They have done documentaries on adoptees who come back and want to search for their birth mother and things like that. I think overwhelmingly, the idea here now is that adoption is acceptable. And if you want to increase your family or if you want children, you can have them, that certainly adoption is a very viable choice in this situation. So inter-Korean adoption, in-country adoptions has become a much more viable option. But again, it depends on the person and the individual experience, I think. But I would definitely encourage any overseas Korean adoptee to really come back. Maybe you won't be able to meet your birth parents, but you'll find an incredibly vibrant culture. And I think that learning about that part of your life is extremely important too, because it is your heritage, frankly.
Well, we've run a bit over time, so
Oh,
I think we're going to have to close it at this
I have to
point.
get to work too. It does.
Thank you very much for the very informative and enlightening presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Oh gosh.
And yeah, we'll
Well, Mike, I
look
couldn't
forward to
have
the
done
next
it
one.
without you. I couldn't have done it without you. So I really appreciate all of your time and doing a practice run on Sunday evening, your time. That was fantastic. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So,
It's my pleasure.
no, great.
All right.
Okie
Okay.
doke.
I'll go ahead and
Okay.
close here.
All righty.
Okay.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.